There comes a point where scaling isn't just about finding the next product. It's when you have to stop and rethink how you run your business before everything breaks. A moment when you turn your chaotic startup into a real business. Over the years, I've systemized over 100 ecom brands, and today I'm going to show you how I'm helping a $20 million seller scale to 50 million and beyond. So in this video, you are going to see exactly how we are transforming their business into a well-oiled machine that will unlock the next level of scale for them. So let's get into it. Every business is different, but when it comes to systemizing, we can follow the same roadmap. This roadmap is based on a framework that has 9 components that I'm going to cover in today's video. I also like to divide this framework further into 3 different stages. Stage number 1 is where we begin. That is all about systemizing. That is about designing the machine. Stage number 2 is all about delegating. And here it's all about the team. And lastly, the last stage is all about scale. This means determining the strategy, how to actually grow the business. So you can actually follow along and apply the same framework and roadmap to your business. So let's begin with the systems design. This is the first step where we actually have to understand how the machine works and look at it from a high level perspective. When it comes to system design, I like to do this in 3 steps. Step number 1 is to plan, is to understand the system we want to build. Let's say product development, right? These systems will correspond with the core functions of the business. So you will likely have something like product development, supply chain management, marketing, and so on. When it comes to planning, I really like to just take a look at a high level to understand the function, but also determine who is the owner of this particular system, who is accountable for running the system. Also, I like to draft out the key activities that happen in the system, right? When it comes to product development, it can be generating product ideas, validating product ideas, creating listings, all the way to ranking and launching, right? Just mapping out and writing it down on a high level. It's also very helpful to actually determine where the system starts and where it ends, right? So for example, this one could start with some product ideation routine and end with a successfully launched and established product. Once we have this plan and we understand on a high level how the system is going to work, I like to break it down further into processes. So let's say we have the product development system that we can then further break down into different processes, right? So for example, we can have research and development, we can have content, and lastly, we can have launch and ranking and evaluation of the launch performance, right? Now we are breaking it down and we are using the same logic behind it, that each process, we should understand who is the owner of the process, who is going to be responsible for that, still on a very high level, and understand what triggers the process and where it ends, right? This is very important because that will essentially determine everything else we do later on. And this is where we spend a lot of time with each and every seller to actually build out the machine, right? And step 3 is to map out each process. And mapping out for that, we are using process maps, right? Just simply documenting all of the tasks and decisions that need to happen within that particular process, right? The logical sequence, what needs to happen. As I said, research and development, it can start with product ideation, then the idea validation, right? That is the sequence in this particular process. And we do that for every single one of those. Once we have that, we can move on to the next part of this framework, which I call the execution hub, right? At this point, we mapped out what the system is about. We mapped out the people that are involved in these processes. We have a pretty good idea about the sequence of tasks and decisions that happen within that particular process. But now we actually need to put it into work, right? Because we strategize, we have our canvas, right? We mapped out everything, but now we need to put it in work. And I call this the execution hub, right? We have these 2 parts where first one is the company wiki. Think about this as the brain. This is your procedures, your playbooks, understanding how the key parts of the process need to be executed. And then, of course, the task management. That's where all the work happens. That's where we see the accountability, the reminders, the deadlines, and everything that happens based on the workflow needs to be built out. Of course, we do not build the company wiki and SOP. We don't build for every single step. What we do when we map out the processes, we identify the areas that might require a playbook, that might require an SOP, because maybe it's a more complex step, maybe we need to train our team better to actually do that, right? When we talk about accountability. So we don't necessarily create an SOP for every single thing, but only for the stages where it needs to be done perfectly. Once we have the company wiki, once we document how things are supposed to be done, then we can build out our task management, right? It can be Asana, ClickUp, Monday. It doesn't really matter. As long as it allows us to create task templates, to create routines that actually reflect the workflow we built out before, right? For example, if you have your product ideation routine, you better specify how often it happens. And when you decide to launch a product and go through these validation steps, this is where we tick off the tasks, right? Essentially, every task is either a template or routine and needs to be predefined. Because you will realize that majority of the things you do in your business are actually repeatable, right? There is really a few things that you do only one time. Most of the things we do repeatedly. Therefore, it should be systemized, it should be templatized, it should be turned into a routine. And as you can see, all of this actually works in a very nice harmony because we have the process maps and we have the company wiki and we have the task management, and everything works nicely together, right? Because task management is always linking back to our company wiki, and both of these are built according to the workflows we defined right here. And as I said, this is where you spend most of your time when you are systemizing your business, right? Because this is what determines and helps everything else to fit nicely together. Because let me show you, if we go to the third one, the third part, I call this the CEO dashboard. And this is all about really keeping your finger on the pulse of the business. Because especially if you reach a certain scale, 8 figures and beyond, you as a CEO will kind of start losing touch with the operations, which is perfectly fine. That's kind of the idea, right? That you will remove yourself from the operations. But you still should have your finger on the pulse to see how the business and how these different systems are performing. And the CEO dashboard is exactly that, right? You can call it KPIs, you can call it scorecards, but at the end of the day, each of your systems should have these KPIs that will help you understand whether the system is performing well or not. Let's say for our product development pipeline, it can be the number of ideas generated, the conversion rate from ideas to products we actually launch. So you can monitor these on a weekly basis to see how your team is running that particular process. So for example, when we are mapping out our process, we can also identify, here we identify that we will need the playbook, but we might also identify that here in the process, we should track a specific KPI, right? So as you can see, now we are going back to our process map and we are trying to identify what are the key numbers we want to track to help us see how that particular process is performing without us having to step in, right? And we do this for every single system, every single process in the business. So we may end up with a CEO dashboard that has week by week the KPIs where we track how the business is performing. Of course, you track your evergreen KPIs, evergreen metrics, your revenue, your profit, your margins, but you also want to track the lead indicators, right? Because you don't want just to track the number of products launched, but you want to track how many ideas you generated, because ultimately the number of ideas generated determines how many products you launched. And you should apply this logic to every single system in the business, not only the lag indicators, which we like to track as profit and revenue, but also the lead indicators, the activities that lead to the results we want. And of course, in our CEO dashboard, we also like to track our strategic objectives. And I will talk about this a bit later when we talk about the strategy. Remember, we have these 3 stages: systemize, delegate, scale. Scale is all about strategy. So when we determine strategic objectives, how we want to grow the business, we are not just troubleshooting, how we want to grow the business, that will also be in our CEO dashboard. Now, the last component of the systemize level, right, the systems level, is defining the dream team, what the dream team architecture would look like. Because the way I think about team is that the great team is created, not hired. In the sense that if you are building a sports team, you know what the roles should be, and now you are trying to find the perfect person that would fit into that role. But we need to determine what those roles are first in order to then find the perfect fit. Maybe we already have a team, but for this exercise, when we are defining what the ideal team would look like for this business, we kind of forget about the existing team for now, and we start drafting based on the systems right here. We start drafting what the team should look like, right? So we can always have, the CEO, the visionary that determines the strategy. We will have some department for all of the supply chain management. We can have brand management and product specialists, right, for running our product development pipeline. So we will kind of define what these roles in the business are in terms of accountability, right? Someone accountable for supply chain, someone accountable for PPC management, someone accountable for product ideation, validation, working with suppliers, and so on. So once we create this accountability chart, we can also start thinking about the existing team and kind of identifying who on the team is sitting in multiple seats. You might hear this as, wearing multiple hats. As an entrepreneur, when you launch your business, you are wearing multiple hats. And what does this mean is that you are essentially the supply chain manager, the operations manager, you are your product development specialist, you are wearing multiple hats, or you are sitting in multiple seats. Of course, this is not very desirable, especially if you want to unlock the next level of scale of the business. That's why the next stage, now we are moving into the team section, right? Here we covered the systems, and now we are moving into the team section where we start working with the labor and essentially planning the talent, what needs to change, if we need to hire, bring someone on board, promote, fire, all of this. I call this step the talent planner. And the first step here is identify the bottlenecks. Really think about the ideal team architecture we defined right here and take a look who is overwhelmed, who is not ready for the next level of scale, right? If you want to grow business from 20 to 30, 40, 50, you need to 2x, 3x your business. It is possible that the current team structure is just not supporting this level of growth. Some people might be overwhelmed, right? Some people might not be up to the task. So we need to identify the bottlenecks and do an audit. Essentially find what are these issues, the people sitting in multiple seats, the people overwhelmed, the people that are not skilled enough. After that, we will clarify a redesign plan, right? How we want to redesign the team, essentially comparing the current structure versus the desired. And of course, the desired structure will reflect the dream team architecture we created right here. So in many cases, it will mean, hiring a new person, promoting someone and training them, and or maybe it's firing someone if they are just not a good fit for the next level of scale, for the next level of the business. That's why the last step is to take the action, right? To create action plans to make these changes. For example, one of the most common ones will be hiring. So it means creating a hiring funnel. We will have the job description, we will have the questionnaire, we will have the test task until we find a good fit for our new desired team structure, right? Sometimes it means promoting someone or firing someone. When we fire someone, we want to make sure that there are clear handoffs, likely to a new person we hired. Or if we want to promote someone, let's say our operations manager is often a good fit to be the COO of the business. So we need to put a plan in place because that's not going to happen overnight. So it can be 1 to 2 months plan to actually get our business into the desired team structure. Right? As you can see, it's all building on top of the systems we created. That's why we spent 6 weeks, sometimes even more, designing the systems. Because once we have them, everything else is easier. Because as you can see, the team structure reflects the systems we designed, right? And then everything else, if we decide to hire someone or change the job description, again, this is based on the systems we designed, right? So everything fits nicely together. That's why this framework is so powerful. The next step in the team section is meeting rhythm. Once we have the team, we actually need to define how we operate with the team. And here, I always like to remember no scorecard, no meeting, right? We want to prevent meetings that do not have any purpose. That would be a waste of time. So essentially what we want to determine is who should attend a meeting, what is going to be discussed, and when, in other words, how often we will do this meeting. Generally speaking, we want to implement this structure. We want to have a weekly check-in with our team members, and we want to also do a monthly review. But this meeting rhythm is actually closely related to our strategy, which we will discuss later. Because essentially, when we talk about strategy, we have the long-term vision, on our 3-year plan, yearly plan, quarterly plans. So this really transfers into the meeting rhythm, right? Where we help our team members to do the job, to actually get us where we need to go. And when it comes to weekly check-in, we usually review the scorecards that are related to that role. And when it comes to monthly reviews, we decide whether we need to pivot, we need to decide whether there are any issues. But more often than not, you will be discussing some obstacles, right? It's not always smooth, not always everything goes well. So I want you to remember what we implement here when it comes to meetings. First of all, we want to keep it as structured as possible so we don't waste anyone's time. But when we are on a call, we ideally want to discuss a specific scorecard, some results, right? Maybe the product launches, maybe PPC performance. Doesn't matter, there should be some number, something you are trying to optimize. So when it comes to the IDS method, it is quite straightforward. First of all, we need to identify the problem we are trying to solve, then discuss it, come up with solutions, decide what needs to be done, brainstorm together. And lastly, solve, decide on an action plan, how it's going to be implemented going forward. But I also would like you to remember the 1-3-1 rule. And this is especially powerful when you want to encourage ownership in your team. The 1-3-1 rule is that when a team member comes to you and they have one problem they want to discuss and they want your help with that, in order to present this to you, you also require them to come up with 3 different solutions to that problem. And lastly, you want their one recommendation, what they think is the best course of action, right? So they come with clearly identified problem, they come up with 3 possible solutions to that problem, and they also present one recommendation, what they think is the best course of action. Because really, what you're trying to do here is that you want to encourage ownership. You want them to solve these on their own. Of course, you are there to help, but ideally, you don't want them just to rely on you. You want them to think, solution-oriented person. So that is how we will do that. So 1-3-1 rule and the IDS method when it comes to your regular meetings. Now, the last part of the team section here is the communication, how we are going to communicate. Because if your business is small, you have 1-2 people on your team, it's simple. You likely send messages on WhatsApp. Why not, right? You hop on Google Meet when you need to. But once your business starts to grow, you have 5, 8, maybe 10 employees, maybe even more, 15 employees. you need to define how people are going to communicate in your business to be as efficient as possible. You don't want everyone to waste time, you don't want people to constantly check in with each other on Slack and disturb each other. So we need to create the communication architecture of the business. And really here we have two things we need to define. The first one I call team tools. First of all, you need to decide on the software stack you are going to use, right? How people are going to interact with each other. It can be, your task management system, which can be Asana. It can be Slack. It can be Missive for email management. You just define the tools you are using that really meet what you need, right? That really fit your business. So you will likely have these or maybe something else. I would also recommend to keep these away from your personal stuff, right? So no WhatsApp, no Facebook, no Instagram messaging between team members. Really try to keep it organized, because we will also talk about how to leverage AI, and usually AI gets access to, let's say, something like Slack instead of your WhatsApp, right? So you need to be ready for that. Also, when it comes to the team tools, we need to define the structure, in a sense, how we are going to use Slack, the structure, the channels, right? What goes where. And with that, we want to define the rules. Essentially, what kind of communication goes into Asana, right? Task updates, very structured, very organized. Asana, not for chatting. For chatting, we have Slack. And if you use Slack, you better follow the rules to use specific channels. Again, we want to set up the structure so it's organized, so everyone has access to information they need as easily as possible. And the second part of the communication is updates. How reports are going to be shared, right? We define the scorecards, so how often are the scorecards going to be updated? If someone owns a process, how often and when they are going to update it, right? What data sets they are going to use to update it, right? So this is important. Essentially, all of the updates and the progress, how often, when, how, right? Very important to determine that. And finally, we are getting into the strategy section, right, of our framework. So the first part here is our strategy compass. And this really determines the direction of the business, right? I like to start with an ultimate goal. You can call this a vision, but for most sellers, they have some ultimate goal, maybe selling the business for a certain amount, or maybe you have something bigger, some vision. So that would be for you determining what are you trying to do in the long run. Based on that, we will do an opportunity analysis, what we can do to get to our goal, right? So for example, you see constantly that there are new things popping up. Is it TikTok shop? Is it expanding to Europe? There are many different opportunities, and you want to identify these opportunities and figure out which ones are not for you. You're not going to pursue those, but you also want to figure out which ones are a good fit for your business, right? Analyzing the opportunity. And once you do that, you also prioritize. What are you going to do in the upcoming year or so, right? And I like to use the ICE method, which means that you first need to understand the impact of that particular project, of that particular opportunity, right? So ideally, you will be trying to quantify that, how it would affect your revenue in terms if your ultimate goal is to sell for a certain amount. And also, then we have the C, which is the confidence. How likely you think, what is your confidence that this will actually happen, that you will reach and make the impact on your revenue, right? So it can be high, low, moderate, right? Important to also determine that. And the last one is effort. To understand how much work is it going to take. Work in the sense of your team, but also some other resources, effort you need to invest into that, right? And once you combine these, you essentially want to identify the path of least resistance, right? Just identify the areas where the impact is high, the confidence is high, and the effort is low. Rarely ever there will be something like that, but that would be your priority. And once you do that, you can actually move into the last part of this whole framework. And the last part of the strategy is a strategy rhythm. And this is a planning system that really breaks down what we are trying to achieve brings it from the long-term vision into today's execution, right? So this is common sense, but often common sense is not common practice. So we are breaking down the vision into yearly plan, quarterly plan, and of course, then breaking it further into monthly and defining what the team needs to do. But what's important here, we call it strategy rhythm, because as you can see, it relates closely to the meeting rhythms with your team. Because overall, this thing is the business rhythm, how everything flows. Because if you really think about it, the planning, the strategy is also a meeting. If you have a bigger, the planning session, because if you have a bigger leadership team, it's probably just not you creating the plans. Maybe you have your COO, so you are creating the plans together. So your yearly planning session, of course, should also have some agenda, right? Some things you want to discuss. Similarly to our meeting rhythm has also agenda, how we approach this, right? Reviewing last year, determining the strategic objectives for the year. This is also a meeting. It is a leadership meeting. And when it flows down from the strategy, from our plans, we need to communicate this with our team. That is where we have the handover between the strategy, between the leadership and the team that's actually running the execution, right? So our yearly and quarterly plans are done with the leadership, and then the monthly reviews, the progress towards our goals, and the weekly check-ins, just making sure that we are on track in terms of the lead indicators. That is where the handover is between the strategy and the meetings, right? So overall, this works nicely together, but I like to keep them separated because at the end of the day, this is for the leadership, the prioritization, the strategy, but it is very much closely related, right? Because when I'm planning, I'm looking for the long run and I'm trying to break it down to my yearly, quarterly, monthly, weekly plans. But when it comes to meeting and tracking my progress towards those goals, I do it the other way around, right? I have my weekly meetings with the people executing, making sure that they are doing what needs to be done. Monthly reviews, making sure that we are on track, and if not, we need to pivot. And then our quarterly reviews to make sure that we are working towards our goal for the whole year. So this is the system in general, and you can see everything fits nicely together and all starts with the systems. I know this is the stuff that people often want to skip, but it starts with the systems because everything else is then built on top of that. That is the foundation. That's it for today. If you want my help to systemize your business and build the right team, there will be a link in the description. And if you want to see another video where I break down this process step by step with specific examples, there will be a link in the description and here on the screen. I will see you next week. Bye.